This video we have a great topic, formulas to extract records from data sets with criteria. So let's click on the link for sheet 16. That jumps me over to sheet 16. Now, a very common task that people have in Excel is they have a big data set and they need to extract just some of the records. So here's what we're going to look at in this video. Filter, advanced filter, and then our formulas. A non-array formula with helper column in the index function. Array formula using small and index, and then array formula using aggregate and index. Now, these three methods or formulas, filter and advanced filter, are usually not used with formulas. Sometimes you have a helper column in filter, or sometimes with advanced filter you can have a criteria formula. But here's the thing about extracting records. These are the built-in methods that Excel provides for extracting records. And they rule. They are easy and quick, especially when you compare filter to how complicated some of these advanced array formulas are going to be for extracting records. So the question is, why in the world would we use formulas to extract records when there is the filter feature? Well, the bottom line is filter and advanced filter usually take a few clicks. And it's not automatic. Formulas, as soon as you type the criteria into the cell and hit Enter, the data set is immediately extracted. And so that is one of the main reasons that people like formulas. They can build solutions that then are easy for people to use. Or if they are continually changing the criteria, it's just a little bit faster. So the setup up front is much more difficult for formulas. All right. Now, number two here, formulas to extract records often contain large numbers of ranges and calculations, and therefore will increase spreadsheet calculation time. You can imagine if you have 50,000 rows of data and 30 columns, and you have all this criteria, the formulas can get huge. So to counteract that, we're always going to consider helper cells, columns, Boolean logic construction, and efficient functions. We've done a lot of that already. All right, we want to take a brief look at filter and then advanced filter. Here's a data set, and here's our criteria. Now, normally for filter, you don't put your field names and criteria in the cells. I just have that there for this video. I'm going to click in a single cell and turn on the filter. That's on data, and then you can click the filter, or you can use Ctrl Shift L. Now, what's so amazing about this is you don't have to know much about Excel. You can click on the filter arrow at the top of each field and look through. Now, the amazing date filters in since 2007 make it worth getting 2007, 10, or 13 just for all the amazing things you can do for dates. I'm going to select between. This has been around a long time. This is after or equal to, so I'm going to put 6/1/2012. Whoops. And then is before or equal to 5/31/2013. Now, this is and. This is between. That means each cell will get the same two questions. And if it meets both questions, which is an and criteria, it will show that record. Now, we still have one further filter to make, or criteria. So I'm going to uncheck and then check West. So there's three criteria applied to this. Now, watch this. Control asterisk on the number pad, or Control Shift 8 to highlight, and Control C. Now, notice the dancing ants are not just going around the outside. That is visible cells only. So filter is very polite. When you copy the highlighted set, it's not copying all the hidden rows. It's copying just the visible cells. Control C and then Control V. That is amazing. So filter rules. It's easy. Almost anybody can do it. The one thing is, though, if I come up here and type East, this data set doesn't automatically update, but formulas will. Now, I'm going to Control Z. Let's scroll down here, and we'll look at advanced filter. All right, advanced filter, you have to put the field names in the cells and the criteria below. Now, and criteria goes on the same line, or criteria, which we're not doing here, would go on different lines, like west or east. Now, you can repeat the field names here, because here we're going to be asking two questions of each cell here, right? Are you between these two, greater than or equal to this, less than or equal to this? Now, advanced filter, you click in a single cell, just like filter, go up to data and click on advanced. Or you can Alt-AQ. Now, if you've already done some filtering up above, it guesses wrong. So I'm going to scroll down and redirect it by highlighting the field names and the table. I want to copy to another location the criteria, field names, and criteria below. And copy to, I'm going to put it in, let's see, X. So X56. Now, as soon as I click OK, boom. The data set is not changed. Notice there's no filter or anything, but over to the side, or wherever you choose to put it, there is our extracted records. Advanced filter and filter are absolutely amazing, especially the filter, because not only can beginners get along with filter real easy, but even advanced user, you like the filter because it's so quick and easy. So if you're data extracting just something simple, quick and easy one time, boom, filter is the way to go. But you're going to have your criteria changing in the cells. Formulas rule. Now, for formulas, there are two fundamental problems that make the formulas for extracting records so complicated. So this is really an important point to understand the two problems. Now, if you know how to do lookup or VLOOKUP or any lookup function, what usually happens? You have some column with a unique identifier, and you retrieve a single record. But look what happens. When we list our criteria, it turns out that we have two records, which A means there are duplicates. So that causes a problem. And B, how do you get a lookup formula to extract more than one item? So those are really the two fundamental problems with normal lookup functions. Now, as we talked about, we're going to have three basic formula solutions. We'll look at the two array formulas in example 7 and 8. But for example 6, we want to look at the helper column non-array solution. And this is a great solution, especially when you have large data sets. Now, remember, why do we use any of these formulas anyway? Because if you change the criteria here, instantly updates. Now, we're going to create this helper column here, but you can see the records are just automatically changing over here. So if I change the criteria, instantly the records update. I'm going to Control ZZ. Now, for this helper column solution, we're going to do something interesting. We're actually going to create a formula that will list numbers. And anytime it lists the number for the first time, that means this is the record we want. So here's a 2. This is the record we want. Once we do that, notice there are duplicates, but we can simply use the match function and index together and say look up 1, 2, 3, etc. Using exact match lookup, match will only take the first one and ignore all the other duplicates. Now, let's see how to do this helper column solution. All right. Well, what is true? We can use the AND function. And I mentioned the AND function in video, I think it was 14 when we talked about Boolean logic. It doesn't have many uses in array formulas, but here in the helper column, it would be great because it's easy to use 3 criteria in the AND. Only when all 3 get a true will the AND deliver a true. So I'm going to say, is that relative cell reference greater than or equal to our lower date, F4 to lock it, comma to get to the next logical test, date less than or equal to our upper date, F4, comma, and finally, is the region equal to that criteria, F4. Now, the AND will deliver a true. Double click and send it down. You could build an array formula off of this, but look at that. We still have the problem of duplicates. All right, so we're going to build a unique identifier here. Now, I'm going to show you something here. What if, trues and falses, we know can be converted to 1s and 0s if we do any math operation. Well, what if we go like this? The cell above plus. Now, notice I started in the second cell, not in the first one. But watch this. What's false plus another false? 0. I double click and send it down. What's true plus the 0 from above? So we got a true for the and that. 0 plus true is 1. When it gets down to here, it's looking at this 1, 1, 1. Cell above 1 plus a new true. That's 2. So there is our column of numbers. Now, so I'm going to try and copy this up. Oh, value error. And why do we get a value error? Because you are not allowed to add a word and a logical value or a number, right? Anytime a word is in a math operation with a regular operator like plus, minus, times, etc., it says no. But guess what? There's a built-in function that is adds and is programmed to ignore text. So now I'm going to say sum, that number, and whatever that is. That logical will automatically get converted to a 1 or a 0 because it's doing a math operation inside the sum function. That will work. Double click and send it down. All right, so, and the great thing about this method of helper column, and we'll see some much more complicated criteria later with and or, is you just use your and or functions, right, inside the sum and add that one above right there because I have some text. Now, how do I count? Because we're always keeping in mind how do we minimize the size of our formulas. Right now there's 2 records. So everything past 3, 4, and 5, or everything past 2 needs to show up as a blank. So we're going to try and build our formula smartly. I need to know how many records there are. So instead of doing it inside the formula here and having to repeat it, use a helper cell. And this one's easy, max. I still remember Vogue at Mr. Excel message board. I learned this this max trick in a helper column like that from him, and something similar with a helper column. But that is a cool trick, right? I don't have to do anything fancy. I say, hey, give me the max. That'll give me the count. All right, now we can do a basic lookup function equals index. So I'm going to say index. What's the array? Well, notice I have date, region, customer, unit. So I'm going to highlight the whole date column. F4 to lock it, but I'm going to hit F4 twice. I need the row lock, but not the column. As I copy down, it's locked. But when I move over, that dancing ants will move to region, comma. The row number, I'm simply using match. What's the lookup value? Ah, the number. Now, in just a moment, we'll see how to. Sometimes you can't have this number column here. So over here, we'll see how to do what's called a formula number incrementer. But here, I have my number 1 there. So I'm going to hit the F4 key 3 times. Lock the column, because going this way I need a 1. But when I copy down, I need the dancing ants to move to the 2. And where am I looking up? What lookup array? This helper column, F4. Now, how do we deal with duplicates? Normally, it would be a problem, but not here. I only want the first 1 and the first 2. So, comma, match type, exact. When you do exact match, it only takes the first one, and that is beautiful for us. All right, close parentheses on the match, close parentheses on the index. Now, when I copy this over, it's going to copy that date formatting, so I'm immediately going to say fill without formatting. And then I'm going to copy it down. All right, so we get a bunch of NAs, and we don't want that to show up. So that's where this count comes in. I'm simply going to say if, and here's that number right there. F4 to lock it on the column and not the row. Whenever that is greater than our count up here. Now notice, I'm going to hit F4, the logical test. Notice we could have put that max right there in the formula and not had this helper cell, but then it would have to run the max all these different times. All right, so logical test, comma. If it's true that we're past row 2, what's the value if true? Double quote, double quote. Now that's really handy because this formula here will never run the index when it gets past row 2. So that also will save calculation time. And we'll compare that to if error in just a moment. All right, close parentheses, Control Enter. I'm going to highlight all the cells. This is not an array formula. All the cells highlighted, I hit F2 to populate all the cells with the formula. I simply Control Enter. Absolutely amazing. Now, if I change this to east, totally beautiful. Control Z. That is why you do formulas. Now, let's look at a couple things here. If you could not have this column, we could go ahead and say if rows. That's our formula number incrementer. We lock the 100, but not this 100. So rows tells us how many rows there are. Right now it's 100 to 100. There's one row. When I get down here, 100 to 101, how many are there? So this little piece right here shows a 2. F9. All right, so then we're comparing it to up here. Absolutely beautiful. Not only that, but it's important to have total relative. Well, I mean, it's convenient to have total relative and just the row lock. Because when you get over here, notice it's only looking at a limited number of cells. All right, so that one will work. One other very important thing. We chose, right, to use if, the if function, with a logical test and put the null text string here to show nothing. Anytime it gets down here, this formula is not running the second part of this index. Now let's compare that to the alternative here. We can use if error. And usually with data extraction formulas, you don't want to run if error, because guess what? In order to get the error, which is down here, it has to run the index match. Whereas up here, it doesn't have to. Once it gets past the second row, it doesn't have to run it anymore. And we'll definitely talk more about the if error for data extraction formulas coming up. Now, let's move on to our 7th example. We want to talk about how to use index and small. All right, one of the fundamental problems we talked about earlier is that if we have a data set, there's 10 records. So the relative position of the record we want is 7 and 10. So how in the world, in our lookup formula, do we get a 7 in this row and then a 10th relative position in this row? And then if we change the criteria, our lookup function automatically knows which row. Well, let's start on the inside of our formula. And we've already seen how to create an array of relative positions. We simply take the row, and I'm going to F4 that. Now, that's not going to work because this will give me 127 if I F9 this to 136. Well, simply, those are rows. We need relative positions, so we subtract row of the first one. Now, what's 127 minus 127? 0. So I don't want to start with 0, so we add 1 back in. This is really one of the most essential parts to our any data extraction formula. Now I'm going to hit the F9. That gives me all the rows. Remember, we just want 7 and 10. No problem. For the small function, we're going to use 3 ifs, all strung in a row, to isolate just the relative position numbers we want, 7 and 10. So if, and we have our 3 criteria. I highlight the date column, F4. Anything in there greater than or equal to the lower date, F4. Comma. Now, value of true, I put my next if. Same date column, F4. This one is less than or equal to the upper date, F4. Comma, a third if, region column, F4, whenever you are equal to that region criteria, F4. Now, the logical test, we have 3 ifs there. Only when we get true, 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 comma, will it take the row number. Now, value if false, we just close the parentheses off. We do not put any value if false. So 1, 2, 3. I wait till I see the black closing parentheses. I know I have put the last parentheses. Now I'm going to highlight this and hit the F9. Oh, that is beautiful. Falses are there. Only the 7 and the 10. That's creating the array of relative positions. That's the most inner working part of most data extraction array formulas. Now, what do? We need a 7 in this row and a 10 in this row. We use the small function. The small can take the first smallest, second smallest, third smallest. First, second. We only have 2 in this one. Control Z. So I put that array of falses and relative position numbers into the small. There's the array, comma, and my number incrementer. I need 1, 2, 3 as I copy the formula down. So I use rows with an S. Now I'm sitting in I 128. So I'm going to type I $128 colon and then I 128 relative cell reference. Notice 128 is locked, the other one is not. So as I copy down, it'll give me 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. Now the K there, I close that off. I'm going to have to enter this. Remember, there's an array calculation right there inside the logical test. If function trumps all other functions, no matter where you put this, we're going to have to do Ctrl Shift Enter. So I'm going to do Ctrl Shift Enter just to see if the small part of this is working correctly. Ctrl Shift Enter, I can see the curly brackets up in my formula. Man, that's a long formula. All right, so I copy this over and copy it down. And look at that, 710, the num error we'll deal with if I type east. Oh, that is amazing. If I change this to 1, look at that. Those row numbers, relative positions of the records that match my criteria are showing up perfect. Now I'm going to Control Z. Now I simply put, remember, that huge thing is just delivering a row number. All right, index. And I'm simply going to highlight the part of the data set that I am extracting. Now, the date column, I need date, region, customer, units. So now I'm going to hit the F4 key and lock only the row reference. Locked on the date as I go down. But when I move to region, it will move relatively. That's the array, comma, row number. That whole small is just getting a row number for the index. Ready? Control Shift and Enter. I can see my curly brackets up there. Copy it over and down. Now that should be date. Let's do it right now. Control 1, date. There it is. Click OK. All right, now we need to turn the num error off. So I'm simply going to do what? Now I want you to look at something here. This is a huge array formula with all these array calculations, right? If we used if error, which down here I show you that same formula with if error. The if error, this whole index thing here with all these array calculations have to run in all of these rows just to get this null text string, which means show nothing, right? So instead of using if error, we definitely want to use the if. And I need my number incrementer because I don't have a number column right here. So I'm going to copy that. And the logical test is going to be number incrementer, meaning 1, 2, 3, 4, anytime you're greater than this hurdle. Now I'll come look at that hurdle formula in just a moment. F4. Right? So anytime we're greater than the number of records that match our criteria, that's the logical test, comma, show a null text string. That will show nothing, comma. And the value of false, that whole big index. Remember, the beauty of this is that when this comes out true, it's going to be only putting a null text string and not running that whole index. Now we have to Control Shift and Enter. Now when I copy this over, now I got the date number format coming over. So I'm going to point to the smart tag and fill without formatting, and then double click and send it down. Now this formula up here, we just with 3 criteria in 2007, you just use a straight COUNTIFs. We've looked at this formula in earlier videos. If you don't have COUNTIFs to count with 3 criteria, no problem. The amazing sum product. And we've seen that formula before also. Now let's go ahead and check. I'm going to type Midwest. Now why are there 0 records counted up here and showing? Because there are no records that match this. Don't be afraid if you get a 0 here. This is like a query where you get a 0 result. It just means there are no records that match. Looks like I can't type as always. Midwest. So there's one in the Midwest. Control ZZ. Absolutely amazing the way our solution for extracting records absolutely immediately responds to any criteria change. Anytime you have that situation, that is an amazing way to go. Data analysis on the fly. Now let's look at our next solution. Here we use index and small. It requires Control Shift Enter. It works in any version. Now notice we had 3 tests, and we were using AND criteria. But this requires Control Shift Enter. Let's go and see a new function in 2010 called aggregate. That's a lot of notes. There's some notes on the aggregate. Here's example 9. Now the only difference is we're using index and aggregate instead of small. Aggregate allows us to do an array calculation and not have to do Control Shift Enter. Now the aggregate is going to do the same thing the small did. It's going to find relative position 7 and 10 and deliver it to the index function. Now we're going to start with our same formula element that delivers all the relative positions or row numbers for index, so F9. But how we're going to get just the 7 and 10 is different. With the if, we strung 3 ifs and got the falses. Here, we're actually going to put this in parentheses because we're going to have some other calculations after, and we need that plus and minus to happen first. And we're going to divide. Everything below the division is going to be the criteria. We have to string together with Boolean. And since it's and, we do multiplying. So I'm going to 2 parentheses, because we have to do all the multiplying, which is to the right of this division before that division. So the first one, F4 equals greater than or equal to the lower date, F4. Close parentheses. Now we multiply. Date column, F4, less than or equal to the upper date, F4. And finally, we have one last Boolean multiplying. Anything in the region column, F4 equals the region, F4. All right, so the greens, when I do this, F9, that gives me 1s and 0s. Right? The 1s are the relative positions, right? That's the 7th position. That's the 10th position. Now, anytime you divide by 0, what happens? Control Z, F9. Whoops, I must have forgotten. Oh, yes, I forgot the last parentheses right there. F9, you get divide by 0 error. There's a 7. There's a 10. So the difference in the arrays when you use aggregate is you got divide by 0, whereas if you do the if and small, you get the falses. But no problem. It's the same basic setup. We have our relative position 7 and 10. Control Z. Now I throw this into the aggregate. Now the aggregate is great if I one more close parenthesis, one more open parentheses. I choose to use the small. We've actually seen the aggregate a few times already. So that's the function number. And here's this beautiful second argument, which is called options. I want number 6. And there it is, that array. That can handle functions 14 to 19 can handle the array calculations. And we've seen that a few times already. All right, now I come to the end, comma. And we know we're using the first one because there's that K. And I need the same number incrementer. And I'm in L241. I'm sorry, I241. So I $241 colon I241. And there we have it. I forgot to do rows. How do you like that? Rows. There we go. So rows of that will give me my formula incrementer as I copy down. I see the K, I close it off, and there we have it. Watch this. I'm not going to Control Shift Enter. I'm just going to Control Enter, copy it over and down. And then I'm going to use Control Shift tilde to apply general number format. You got to be kidding. Right here, that formula is working perfect. And when I look up in the formula bar, I see no curly brackets. That is so cool. Now I can simply wrap the index date column and F4 it twice to lock the row but not the column. And there it is, aggregate or the small, whichever you use, or just delivering a single row number. That's a big formula element to deliver just a row number. All right, Control Enter, no Control Shift Enter. Copy it over and down. Now I'll come and fix that date formatting in just a moment. Now I need to turn it off and on. Again, this is the reminder here. You don't want to run all those array calculations just to get a null text string to show nothing with if error. So I'm simply going to say if, and I'm going to steal this little number incrementer. Anytime you are greater than the number of records that match our criteria, F4, comma, then the value if true, null text string. Please show me nothing. Otherwise, go ahead and run the whole big array formula. All right, close parentheses, Control Enter, no Control Shift Enter. Actually, you know what we could do? We could highlight this whole range, put the active cell in edit mode with F2, and now watch this. Earlier, I couldn't use Control Shift Enter because when you use Ctrl Shift Enter and you enter into a bunch of cells like this, it is considered a single object, a single array calculation. But here, this is an array formula, but we don't have to use Ctrl Shift Enter. So watch this. I can Control Enter. And it enters it into all of the cells just fine. Now I'm going to highlight this and Control 1 and add the date. And absolutely beautiful. I can change this to whatever I want. Formulas are just magic the way they instantly change. All right, we saw the helper column. We saw index aggregate, index small, and even considered the if error. Now let's go time these formulas. And if you scroll down here, number 10, these are the results. If we go to the workbook small aggregate, I'm going to Control O. And if you look in the timing formulas folder, you'll find all the workbooks where I timed formulas. This is a huge data set, 250, let's see, I think it was 250,000. That's a lot of records. Control Home. We did the helper, the aggregate, the small. And over here we have the if error. Now look at the times we got. Less than a second, 26 seconds, 27, 60. So the if error takes the longest. And the reason why is if you have a huge data set like this where you may get 100 records extracted, every one of these formulas in all of these cells, which are showing a null text string, have to run that array calculation. Whereas here, when we do the if, it's not, right? So Control Home. Helper just is unbelievably fast. Aggregate and small, they're about the same, right? I'm going to close this workbook. You can look at that if you want. And again, timing formulas depends on the exact functions and how your computer and how everything is set up in your workbook. So if you want to time, Excel MVP Charles Williams has a great website. You can download the code for timing. Absolutely amazing. But look at this. I mean, if you can use a helper column, when I compare this time compared to this, and what is the decrease from here to there, it's almost 97%. These two are about the same. All right, now, if error looks bad here, but I just have to give a little note here. It's not really anything to do with array formulas. But there's a great use for if error. It's just not, when we're extracting records, probably not a good function to use. But before 2007, if you had a lookup formula here and you typed something that wasn't in your table here, in order to get this not in table, I had to create an if formula with an is error that looked at the VLOOKUP. Then the value if true, which meant we got an error, was that, and the value if false, we had to run the VLOOKUP a second time. So in that case, when if error came out in 2007, it was just like, yes, that's so cool, because now we only have to run VLOOKUP one time. So if error is great, just probably not for data extraction. Hey, guess what? In all of our formulas so far, we have extracted records and listed them vertically. So here I have 1, 2 criteria. I have 3 total records I need to extract the units, right? So what do? Not only for our logical test, but more importantly, for our K argument. This is extracting the row numbers. We have a number incrementer, a formula element. We use rows. We lock the 342 because I'm in cell I342. I lock one of them, the numbers, but not the other. That way, as I copy down, the range expands. You could see it expanding there. And it gives me from 342 to 345. So that's a count of 4. Now, what do when you list them horizontally and not vertically? You simply use columns. So down here in our K argument, the column is locked. The J is locked. The J is not. Columns counts columns. J to J is 1. So we get a 1 there, the first record. A 2, because we get JK, there are 2 columns for this columns formula element number incrementer. So important to realize that. Now, in all the examples we've done so far, we've done and criteria. Both things have to be true. So now we want to switch gears and look at how to extract records with or criteria. Now, the easy way to do it, of course, would be to do filter or advanced filter. Now, back in examples 3 and 4, we talked about and criteria. I'm not going to go through filter and advanced filter again, but by all means, it's the easiest way to do it. Remember, the reason we do formulas? Because we want to change the criteria and everything instantly update. So let's look at our 4 examples of OR criteria. This is under exam 15th. Now we want to talk about OR criteria, extracting records. We're going to look at 4 examples here for OR. Helper, which will be this example here. Then we'll talk about aggregate with Boolean, aggregate with the match function. And if you remember back to video number 14 when we talked about Boolean OR, we saw how to do straight Boolean OR criteria with adding plus or using the match function. So we'll look at both those examples, and we'll also see small and if. Now, if you can do a helper column in your setup, absolutely the fastest calculating. So let's remind ourselves. And actually, we did this example up in example 6. We did same helper column, but we used the AND function. So let's see. We have 2 criteria, and we need to extract all the records into this data extraction area that are either west or east. Well, we can remind ourselves, not the AND, but the OR function. I'm going to say, hey, is that cell, relative cell reference, equal to criteria, and then lock it with the F4. That's the first logical test, comma, same cell equal to our second OR criteria. Notice that we're never going to get 2 trues here, F4, close parentheses. All right, Control Enter, and double click and send it down. Now this gives us trues. If we tried to create a formula over here to extract, we'd have the duplication problem. So it'd be nice if we, as up in example 6, we had 1, 2, 3, 4 to indicate in the helper column that those records should be extracted in that order. Now, remember what we did. We did some operation, because it'd be nice if this was 1, this was 2. Well, one way to accomplish that is to simply do any operation on a logical. Since OR is spitting out true here, I'm going to say the one above plus. Well, what's true plus true? It'll be 2, right? And now when I copy it down, in that cell, what's 2 plus false? It's 2. So I can double click and send this down, and I get my column of numbers here. But we have, just as up in example 6, a problem with this first one. No problem. I'm going to copy this up. All right, so we get a value error, and we saw this before. We can't take a word and add it to a logical or a number because it gives us a value error. So instead of using plus, the addition operator, we use the sum function. Sum function is great because it's programmed to add and ignore text. So right now, it'll add text. It's going to ignore it and then add this or. The fact that we're doing adding in the sum function will convert the or to a 1. So word plus true. With the sum function, it's 1. And then I double click and send it down. Right? Now we have our duplicates, but we saw the trick was use the max function, right? And then we come over here. We do our straight index. Just as we did up in example 6. The key is to do exact match for match. That says when it gets down to this 2 right here, that 0 will pick out only the first one, but not the second occurrence of the number 2. All right, so that's a beautiful way to do it, and it is very fast calculating. Now let's see our array formulas, and we want to talk about the difference between Boolean logic and then the match function. Now I've already started this formula. Here's our data set. And I went ahead and did 2 countif. We talked about different ways for counting with OR criteria. We're never going to get a situation where we can overcount here or where we can get 2 trues. And so in that case, an efficient formula to use is 2 countifs. We're never going to double count, right? Because we can never get a count here and a count here for the same cell. All right, so we got that. Now, we did exact similar formula for AND. We have to turn the formula off when we get past row 7 and show a null text string. And because we don't want to run the index inside the if arrow, we construct our formula this way. We get index on this column here, mixed cell references. We choose to use aggregate if you have 2010 or later. 15 means small. 6 means ignore error. And there are all the rows. So if I F9, you can see I get all of the rows or relative position of our record. So Control Z. When you're using aggregate, you can use division. Now, instead of multiplying for and criteria, we're going to be doing plus. All right, so you do 2 parentheses, and then you ask the question. Anything in there? F4, are you equal to west? F4. Now close parentheses and plus. A new set of parentheses, anything in the region column, F4, equal to east, F4. All right, so we have to put the 2 parentheses there so that we force this plus to calculate before that division. But there we go. If I highlight F9, there is our array of relative positions in our data set that will serve as the row number for index. The divide by 0, no problem. That 6 will say, hey, aggregate, just ignore it. The small calculation is the 15, Control Z. So I have to come to the end, comma, the K, that one right there. Lock the column reference, but not the row. That way, as we go this way, we're always extracting from that array of row numbers the first one. When we move down, it'll move to 2. So close parentheses on the aggregate. Notice that whole aggregate boop, is giving us a row number. Close parentheses on the index, close parentheses on the if. Now, I don't need to use Ctrl Shift Enter, just Control Enter. In fact, I'm going to highlight because I don't want to mess up the formatting. If I copy this over, F2, Control Enter. Right? Absolutely beautiful. So now if I change this to, or I can delete it, right? And it will show me just west. I can show nothing. It shows me nothing. I could type east here, and there it shows me east. So absolutely beautiful extracting with OR criteria. Why do we use these complicated formulas? Because that's simply amazing. I'm going to change the criteria, and the data set instantly updates. Now, let's see how to do match. Now, what did we do here? We only had 2 OR criteria. So it was fairly easy for us to construct the Boolean OR calculation. But what about the match? Now, I didn't set this up very well here. Here, down here, we have the same exact formula, but instead of 2 pluses, 2 array calculations and plus, I'm simply going to use the match. Well, there's no math function, but there is a match function. Now, the lookup value, what does match do? It tells us the relative position. That lookup value, I'm going to give it this entire column here, and then F4. So that calculation right there is an array calculation. Right? The lookup value argument is expecting a single lookup value to return a single relative position. I'm giving it a bunch of stuff. That's 10, so it's going to return 10 answers, comma. And the lookup array, I'm simply hiding those 2 OR criteria there, and I'm going to hit the F4 key to lock it. Right? So now the only 2 possible answers, or 3 possible answers, are position 1, position 2, or not available. Not available means it's not one of our criteria. All right. And then comma, exact match. I'm going to close parentheses. Now let's just see what this match delivers. I'm going to F9. Oh, there it is. 1, 2, not available. Now what are we interested in? We're not really interested in the relative position. We're just interested, well, we are, but we're interested in whether or not it's a number, right? Because we want trues or falses to then extract from our all the relative positions here, just the ones we want. So I'm going to Control Z and just wrap is number. That'll take that array, and if I click right here, that array of NAs and numbers, F9, and tell us just when it's a number. It'll tell us true for a number, false if it's not a number. So now I highlight that little bit there in F9, and there are my trues and falses. Control Z. Now I'm going to highlight the entire array here, F9, and there we have it. 1, 2, divide by 0 for exactly the array of relative positions, which will serve as the row numbers for index. The 6 will ignore the divide by 0, and the 15 will do the small. I'm going to Control Z. Comma, and then the K is going to be this. And lock the column reference, but not the row. Now I'm going to close parentheses. The function argument screen tip tells me that's the row number, that whole big thing right there. Oh, that's amazing. I'm going to close parentheses on that, and then close parentheses on the if. Control Enter. If I copy it over by hand, I better be sure and point to the Smart tag and say Fill Without Formatting, and then double click and send it down. Now I have my match. Now the beauty of this formula is the match. And if you come over to the match, it's that lookup array. If you have a lot of OR criteria, it's just a lot easier to put the range of OR criteria into the lookup array than it is to create that Boolean. Sometimes when you have a lot of OR, this is the quite an elegant solution. And this match to do OR criteria, as I mentioned back in video 14, I learned from Hammy72 at YouTube. Absolutely awesome. All right, so we saw match and Boolean using aggregate. Now we want to see how to use the small function, which will work in any version as opposed to aggregate, which only works in 2010 or later. Now, check this out. This aggregate we did here, we did row and then we divided by, and guess what? The internal Boolean calculation is the same exact one we're going to use for the if. Now earlier when we did if and criteria, we had to string ifs together, because when you have if, that's an and calculation. But this is Boolean plus. So we're simply going to use it in a single if and then dump the row numbers into the small function. So I just copy that. Now I come down here. Now I've already created most of this formula. It is the row number where we need to use the small function, and from the array of relative positions in our data set, extract the first smallest, second smallest as we copy our formula down. So I'm going to click. Oh, and this right here, F9, that's all the row numbers. I don't want them all. Control Z, just the ones that match our OR criteria. So I say if, and then that logical test, I'm going to Control V. Now, comma, and then I'm going to click on the logical test. So I'm going to F9. Beautiful. Control Z. Now what do? I come to the end. The false, I just leave that off and close parentheses. Now I can highlight the small and hit the F9. That whole array of falses and relative positions, row numbers for the index, is sitting inside the array. So now I simply need to have my number incrementer for K, Control Z, comma. I don't have to use the rows because I already have a number right there. And I'm going to lock it with the column, but not the row. There's the K, close parentheses. There's the row number, that big, huge thing right there. For the first record to extract, it better be 1. Control Z. All right, now I close parentheses on the row number, close parentheses on the value of false. And this is Control Shift and Enter. If I Control Enter or Enter, I get a value error because that if function demands that we do, once we do an array calculation there, forget it. You have to do Control Shift Enter. Control Shift and Enter. And I can't do that trick where I highlight all the cells either. It just doesn't work. Copy it over. Be sure to say Fill Without Formatting and double click and send it down. So that's how you do it in 2000, in any version using small and if. Absolutely amazing. Or Boolean adding to get our OR criteria. All right, now let's go look at some timing. So what I did is I timed, and here I have the helper, the Boolean, the match with exact match, and then I did a match with sorted columns, which is not usually possible. But this set here is for 2 criteria. So obviously the helper is much faster. The timing was done in seconds here, right? And this is done on 8,000 rows of data, 2 criteria. So the percentage decrease over the Boolean is dramatic. Obviously, helper columns much faster. Boolean here, in seconds, that was the average. And here's the match with is number. And we got 0.25 and 0.17 here. But this is for 2 criteria. Obviously, if you're doing Boolean and you start getting 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 or criteria in the same column, you are going to be stringing together a lot of array calculations. So let's scroll over to the side. I did 2 tests. That was 2 criteria. This one was with 5 or criteria. And here we got the reverse. The is number match was faster than the Boolean, right? So here, for the helper, obviously, much faster. These 2 solutions are just going to take a lot longer. These are big array calculations. But sometimes you can't use the helper. And so if you have the choice between is number match or Boolean with lots of criteria, looks like the is number and match really has an advantage. Not only is it going to be faster calculating, but it'll also be much easier when you create it. All right, now as always, when we do timing, it depends on your particular situation, how your computer is set up, your calculations, how many criteria, etc. So Charles Williams, Excel MVP, you can download code to time your own formulas. All right, now we want to scroll down and look at a mega example. Here's our situation. We want to extract records that are either West or Whole Food Markets International, and the units are divisible by 5. So the first problem is we can get a count of 2. And so we're going to have to deal with that because we can get West or. So before we were asking an or question of a single cell. Now we're asking an or question this or that. So we can definitely get 2 trues or a count of 2. And then divisible by 5, we're going to use the mod function to determine which one's divisible by 5. Let's look at the helper column first. And in this example, we'll look at the helper, the index, and aggregate, and index in small. Well, first, what does the mod function do? The mod function, I can say, hey, take a number and divide it by some other number. Oops, I hit the F5 instead of F4. And the mod gives you the remainder. So guess what? When we say divide by 5, when it's divisible by 5, mod will deliver the remainder 0. So let's just check this out. Control Enter, and double click and send it down. So there's our remainders, right? But we're only interested in the 0. So I'm going to convert this to a logical formula by saying, is that anytime that's equal to 0? Now it's delivering not numbers, but true or false. I see this formula over here. Was going a little bit crazy there, but that's OK. Now, well, that's one of the conditions. That's the and part. But now we need to do an or. Well, check this out. That's a logical test that either gives us a true or false. And what do we have? 1, 2 tests that need to go into an and function. This happens to be going to be the or function, but it's going to be inside the and. So check this out. I'm going to put and. Now notice, and says logical 1, logical 2. It doesn't say anything about how the formula element actually calculates. So we can keep that right there, no problem. And guess what? We can put the or function inside the and. Because remember, what does the or do? The or can ask a question, and if it gets no trues for both of our questions, it'll deliver a false to the end. But if it gets 1 true or 2, the or just delivers a true. And that's what the and needs here. All right, so I'm going to say, is that one equal to the criteria F4? Inside the or, comma, I get to the second test. that relative cell reference equal to our criteria F4. Now notice the screen tips are going to be helpful here. When I close parentheses there, boom. Oh, so the OR is just sitting inside of the AND as one of the logical tests. There's one of the logical tests. There's another one. So that's how we can do OR and AND in a helper column. All right, Control Enter, double click and send it down. Now, as we've seen a few times already in this video, we need 1, 2, 3 so we can use these numbers over here for data extraction. So I'm simply going to do just as we did the last 2 times, use the sum function. Say, hey, the cell above, please add it to this. Right now, since sum function ignores text, it'll be nothing plus false. That's a false if you F9 it. But math operations on logicals, convert them to either 0 for false, 1 for true. I'm going to Control Z. Close parentheses, Control Enter. Now notice when I copy this down, it's still going to be 0 because 0 plus false is 0. It's not till I get down here that's going to go 0 plus true will give me a 1, and then a 2, etc. All right, so there we have duplicates in a column, but we can simply use exact match function over here inside of index to only take the first occurrence. Here, this formula here is looking up 2. It's only taking the first one, not the duplicates here. Now, look at this. This is date and units. All of the examples we've seen so far, we were extracting all the columns. We only want date and units. So we had to do an actual two-way lookup. Check this out. There's our if to turn it off. And by the way, this was just the max, right? So we have our if turning it off and running showing a null text string. But there's our index. And notice it's the entire two-way table, not including the field names. Then we did the match function, looking up this number in that column right there. So the match, and we made sure to do exact match because we have duplicates and we don't want any of the, we only want the first one. So that match right there. F9, that's just delivering the row number, right, for two-way lookup. Control Z, column number. Oh, so no problem. I looked up the date within that orange range right there, and it either tells me 1, 2, 3, or 4 for column. Absolutely exactly what we want. So then you copy it over and down. So the helper column, absolutely awesome. Now, if we're going to switch to an array formula, we can't use this helper column. We're going to have to think of a way to count with OR and figure out what to do with this divisible by 5. Well, we're going to use the sum product function. Now, we're going to have one array for the mod and the second array will be an OR Boolean. All right, so we're going to in the array 1, we're going to simulate what we first did with our mod function here. So we're going to have to eventually have trues and falses, and we need to convert them to 1s and 0s. So I'm going to do double negative open parentheses and simply do mod. And in the number, not a single number, the whole column of numbers, F4, comma, and I'm going to divide it by 5, F4, close parentheses. Now I want to highlight this. F9, that's what we first saw when we copied the mod function down. That's simulating our little helper column. Now, those are just remainders after doing division, and I'm interested in 0, so Control Z equals 0. Now we get F9, a bunch of trues and falses. Exactly the positions where the number is divisible by 5. Control Z. All right, now I'm going to close parentheses so the double negative can do its work on the trues and falses, comma, in our second array, double negative to convert the trues and falses to 1s, 0s. And we're going to have to do 1, 2, I think 3. We'll come back and fix that if we don't get that right. But check this out. West is the first one, and I'm going to F4. Anytime you're equal to the region, and I'm going to F4. We're actually going to cheat and take these array calculations and use them down here, right? So that's why we're locking them. All right, that's the first one. And I'm going to close parentheses. That's just. Oh, and we're doing or, so it's plus. It's adding. And get the second column. F4 equals the second the criteria for the second column. F4, close parentheses. Now, that right there is our Boolean or calculation, this or that. And we better get a 2 for our first relative position, F9. And sure enough, we get a count of 2. But what do we have to do? We've seen this earlier. We can just say, now, this resultant array is anything in there greater than 0. Control Z. Now, this plus is a math operation, and it calculates before comparative operators. So I can simply go anytime you're greater than 0. All right, so now we have F9. So now we have our trues and false. That's no longer a 2. It's now a true. Control Z. Now I'm going to close parentheses on. And so now we have those, F9, Control Z. And actually, I guess we don't. Do we need that one? We don't need that one. So there we go. So that true and false, we only needed 2 there. Now when I highlight the second array and hit the F9, there we have our ones and zeros that represent the OR criteria. There's no 2 there. If there was a 2 there and we multiplied, some product would get a number too big. It would double count. We saw some great examples of that back in video 14. Control Z. All right, close parentheses and Control Enter. There. Wow, that's a big formula just for counting and an OR. Now I'm going to cheat and copy this. And I'm going to do Control CC. Now, if Control CC doesn't open up the clipboard, you might have to come to Options, and then it's off the screen. But down below here, it says Show Office Clipboard when Control C pressed twice. So you need to check that. Right? So I'll do that again. Control CC. All right. Now I'm also going to get this next calculation here, and I'm going to get just the inside little bit. Control C. So I have these 2 things up here. All right. Now let's come down here and see how to do index and aggregate, and then we'll see how to do index and small. All right. So I've created the base formula here, and I have all the row numbers. And I'm actually going to copy this too and load it up here so I can use it for my small. Control C. Notice this is, we've used this many times. This formula element creates all the relative positions. For aggregate, we're going to divide. Remember, 15 means small. 6 means ignore the divide by 0. Now let's get busy with our criteria. Now this is going to be Boolean. So we're going to have to do and or together. I'm going to do the mod first, right? So that simply is going to give us trues and falses. And I already see I have to force this equal sign. So that's going to get a set of parentheses right there. That's one of the ands. But what do I have to do when I have and? I multiply. And now I'm going to, in open parentheses, and paste the or. Right? So now I'm going to close this off. Right inside here, that plus and greater than symbol will give us our OR calculation. But I need all that to calculate before the AND. So the OR, that'll just give us trues and falses, F9, right? Control Z. But that multiplying will give us the AND. OR, that's the plus, AND. Now I am going to need one more parenthesis because I need to force that multiplying before that division. I don't know what we do without this color coding. Now I'm going to see if I can highlight the array argument in aggregate and hit the F9. And sure enough, wow, 4, 5, and 10. That should be exactly right. The fourth relative position, 5, and 10. Absolutely amazing. And an or, even some divide by 5. Control Z. Now I need to comma and get the K. That's this. And lock the column but not the row. Now watch this. This is devious. Now I close parentheses on the aggregate and I highlight that whole thing F9, it's just giving us the row number. Control Z, but this is two-way lookup. I'm going to have to type a column and do, oh, the column number 2, no problem. Match of this, and that has to be locked going down, but not to the side. So F4 twice to lock the row, but not the column. Comma within that range, F4. And that range is not sorted, so comma 0. Close parentheses. So column number. That's just going to give us a 1 here and a 4 for units. All right, so now index has its row and column. Close parentheses. The value of false, that's just the index, right? Oh, that monstrosity, just to look up something from there. I shouldn't say monstrosity, that amazing, beautiful formula element. Wow. Close parentheses on the if. This just needs Control Enter. I'm going to highlight this whole range, hit F2 so I don't have to deal with the formatting. Control Enter. There's no Control Shift Enter. That's why we're using aggregate. Well, the problem is, of course, not everyone has 2010 or later. So now we come down here. And I have everything in this formula except for the row number. So instead of aggregate, what are we going to do? Small. And we need that array of falses and relative positions. So I'm going to have 2 ifs because this is an and. So if, and I'm just going to plop this mod in the first one. You can see that logical test. So I'm going to come over here. OK, so that's the logical test. So I come to the end. I don't need to put any parentheses because it just gives trues or falses, and logical test can deal with that. Comma. And then if, the second if. Now logical test, watch this. I can just slap the or. And let's click on logical test and hit the F9. Oh, it's giving us trues and falses. But guess what? I don't need that here. I can actually get rid of this. It wouldn't hurt if it's there, but now watch this. F9. 2s and 1s, the if function doesn't care. Any non-zero number is considered a true to the if function. So Control Z. It's not going to worry about overcounting here. All right, so we have our 2. Even though this if right here is or, remember, or goes into a single if. We have 1 if, 2 if. That's our 2 and conditions. Oh, now I'm lost here. Boop. That's the second one, so I'm going to click right there. And now what do we need for value of true? Comma. We need the row numbers. Just slap that right in there. It doesn't need any parentheses like we did with the aggregate. So value if true, just the rows. Now I'm going to very carefully come to the end and close parentheses. And I'm watching the screen tip until it tells me I'm not in the if anymore. There it is. I'm back to the small. Now I'm going to test this. I'm going to click that array. 2 ifs. I'm going to hit the F9. And there we go. There's our array of falses and a 4, 5, and a 10. The relative positions which serve as the row numbers for index. Control Z. I'm going to have to finish comma the K. That's this number 1 F. So there we go. So it locked the column, but not the row. Now I'm watching the screen tip, close parentheses, and that's it. That whole row, the row number is simply small, delivering a relative position F9. Control Z. All right, ready? This requires Control Shift Enter. Control Shift Enter. Oh, I didn't realize that I had all those there. Control Shift and drag it over. Be sure and go to the Smart Tags, say fill without formatting, and copy it down. Now let's see if our amazing setup here will work. If I change this to K. Right, so everything updates. The helper, the formulas for counting, our data extraction formulas. Wow, that is a wild one. Now, there's some notes there. we want to just briefly talk about a few more data extraction situations. We've kind of covered the nuts and bolts here, the and, the or, the aggregate, the small, the helper column. But there's a few other situations where you're extracting data. Actually, let's close the clipboard. I'm going to close the clipboard and give us a little bit more room. A very common formula that people like to use is comparing two lists. Here's list 2. And I'm only interested in the people in this list that are not in list 1. So a helper column solution would be same idea as we did before, except for the logical test is match. And you use match to compare two lists. Is this over in this list? Well, because we're interested in the NAs, meaning the ones that are not there, we say, is it an NA? That formula right there gives us true, false. This adds the one above. We get our duplicate column, helper column, a 1, a 2, and a 3. Those 3 names should be extracted. We can simply count using our max. And there, when we extract it, it's a regular index match formula. Now, what about if you can't have that helper column? No problem. We're simply going to, in 2010, sum product and do is NA match. And again, the idea is instead of a single lookup value for your helper column, you put the whole range for the lookup value. And the lookup array is list number 1. Similarly, when you come down here, for 2010 or later, all of this is the same, aggregate 15.6, row, and then you divide by a simple, there is the is NA. It's just is NA with the match comparing. Remember, we're interested in the names that are here but not there, which if you use match to look this up there, it gives you an NA. In 2000, in other versions, or if you can't use aggregate, no problem, you use that same is NA match. Same is NA match here, except for remember the row number, small if, and the test is the is NA match, exact match, right? Because it's not sorted. And then the value if true, the logical test is going to be the is NA match, and the value if true will be the row numbers. So relatively straightforward, especially compared to some of the formulas we did a little bit earlier. But these are very common data extracting formulas. Now, one last idea here, our last example here. We've talked a lot about speeding up calculations with an extra helper column in the data area. So it's next to the data set. But sometimes you can't have that. Well, guess what? We can, over here sometimes in the data extraction area, have a helper column that will speed up calculations. Now notice we always need the relative position in our lookup formula, right? So instead of having, whoops, let's scroll over here, whatever formula, whether it's small or aggregate, that thing, aggregate or small, is getting us a relative position. But that formula is going to run 1, 2, 3, 4 times in each row here. So if instead we just add a helper column here and run the aggregate or small 1 time for each row, we can get our relative positions and then build a much smaller, faster calculating formula. And remember, row number, that's just the relative position of the item we're extracting, aggregate or small. Instead of putting the formula, put it in a helper column. Wow, that was a lot about data extraction with formulas. We saw all sorts of things, the and criteria, or criteria. We saw helper columns. We saw the small function, the aggregate function. All right, next video, we'll talk about an amazing array function called frequency. All right, see you next video.